Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our webinar series on mastering Ftrack's API. This is session 3 out of 5 total, where we'll be talking about acting and reacting with actions in events in the API. In the previous sessions, we focused on some of the basics first, and then interaction and querying afterward. Both of those are published on YouTube right now if you need them. And the same for this session. It will be available once we're finished. Might need a little editing at the end, but no big deal. And I'll post links to the previous sessions as well in the chat while we're working. Just like last time, my name is Michael Sears, account manager for the Americas here at Backlight. Been with the team for 3 years, like exactly. And joining me once again is Seth Gibson, one of our solutions delivery engineers on the solutions team. Seth has the background in game dev, 3D viz, XR pipeline dev, and over the course of many, many years. So as always, you're in super good hands. He'll be running the bulk of the webinar as usual. A lot of you know this already, but if you're new to these, just use the Q&A panel at any time throughout the presentation, and we'll try to respond in real time. But as usual, for longer answers, we'll have a proper Q&A session at the end of the show as well. And that about does it for intros. So over to you, Seth. I think we can go ahead and get started.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We're glad you decided to stick with us and join us for session 3, because this is where kind of the rubber meets the road. This is where things start to get interesting. We're going to actually look at what you do with the Ftrack API when it comes to customizing your instance, automating workflows, providing custom tools to your users, just all the things that you would do in kind of the day-to-day as a pipeline TD, as a Python developer, or as just a tools programmer. So we're going to look at 2 things today. There are 2 main ways that we do this. One method we call triggers, which is basically just a reaction to an event. If you'll recall from the last session when we were talking about working with the Ftrack API, basically, you might remember that we called out a very specific set of functionality with our session object that lets you bind to what we call our event hub. Well, that's mainly what we're going to be looking at this session, is why you do that and how you take advantage of that connection. So like I said, we'll start with what we call triggers, which is basically just kind of an under the hood reaction, customized reaction to an event. And then we'll look at what we call actions, which is basically an event that is triggered by a user. So more along the lines of a standard tool. So let's go ahead and just set the kind of a general context for how that works. We mentioned the event hub, and again, this is what is responsible for emitting and reacting to specifically our asynchronous events in Ftrack. We have quite a few of those, and there's specific ones that you'll want to subscribe to for different things, which is all in the documentation, and we'll take a look at the basic ones that'll help you get up and running. But as well, you can also provide custom events. So if you need to publish a specific event for a very, very specific bit of functionality that's custom to your workflow or your pipeline, we actually do support that. And this allows you to do very kind of, I guess, expected use cases, things that you would do every day. So say we have a task and we update a status and we want to update another task based on that. That's just something that, there's an event you can listen to. We can get that information and say, hey, this task was updated, so automatically update this other task. We can enforce conventions. So for example, say you have a naming convention that you want your users to respect, we can parse that on say a submit event, and if it maybe falls outside of the guidelines, we can throw up a warning and say, hey, let's reconsider this. And of course, we can notify specific users. So say the status of a task changes and we want to let a specific artist or developer know that, hey, an upstream task has been updated and now it's your turn. We can do that as well. So let's take a look at a very simple example. And the other reason we're starting with events versus actions is that actions build on top of events, and you'll see that a lot of the core logic and implementation for an event is very similar to what you'll do with an action. So in this one, it's very simple, and if you've ever worked with an event-based system, this should look very similar to what you've already done. So we have our callback, which all we're going to do is we're just going to print some information about an entity on an event, and then in our kickoff code, you see that we're subscribing to a specific event. We just called ftrack.update, which is kind of our global catch-all event that just fires whenever the web UI requires an update. We bind our callback to that. We start our session with our connection to the Event Hub, and we go from there. And we'll take a look at this at the end of the section. So, and this is what you can expect from an event. It's again like most of the things in Ftrack, they're dictionary-like objects, so keys, values, and an event encompasses a lot of things. So you'll get a unique ID, you'll get some information about the entities, you'll get some information about users, and as well you'll get a bit of a deep dive into kind of the entities themselves. So really the goal with this is to kind of present to you all the information that we think you would need to do most of the common work you would do on an event in Ftrack. And we try to provide it in a way that's very quick and light for the server, so that we're not sitting there and locking up the web UI or locking up a process based on the result of a trigger. So a more practical example, this is actually built on one of our Ftrack recipes. And so if you've looked at the recipes repo and you've looked at our Cascade status changes event, which is a very popular recipe that I know a lot of folks and a lot of studios have used to build off of, this is a very simplified version of this. So as you can probably guess from our callback on asset version changed, we're going to run this event when something happens to an asset version, and we're going to print some information about that. So what we're going to do in this case is, if the status of an asset version changes, we're just going to print the asset version and the new status name. And it's pretty simple. There's probably no code here that looks out of place from what we've done in the last couple of sessions. Really, all we're doing is we're pulling the data out of the event, the entity data. We're filtering that based on the entity type. We're diving into that entity and looking for the changes. And then we're just doing some simple compares to see if something actually changed. And that's kind of an interesting thing to call out, is that we actually do have a specific schema for changes to entities. So you don't have to do a very long list of compares. You can actually say, hey, what actually changed on this entity during this update? And then, of course, in our actual presentation logic, we're just printing the asset name and some information about the status. So let's go ahead and pause here, jump into the editor, and take a look at how that actually works. Editor up real quick. Okay, and so here you see a different version of this. It's essentially the same as we showed. We're just, instead of printing the simple entity name, we're actually just going to print some information, like I think the whole list of information about the entity, so you can actually see what actually comes over in the event and the entity. So we had a question on our very first session about how to actually work with this code, how to run this code, how to present it to the server. And for development purposes, you can just run this like you would any other script. So you could, if you're in an IDE, you can just hit the play button, or if you're in the command line, you can just Python my script name, and you'll be good to go. So I'll go ahead and run this. And we see that we're listening. So if I pop back over to my web UI, I'll show you what I'm doing here, just so you have context. And all I'm going to do for the sake of this demo is I'm going to grab my project, my demo VFX project that we looked at last time. Probably I'll go into my asset versions. Let's see, actually go back to my project. Go. Put my tasks. Well, let's change our layout, the status of our layout task. Change that to in progress. Okay, so now we have a change. So we basically registered an update. And if I pop back into my Visual Studio instance, see that on that event, we have printed all this information about the, I believe we're just looking at the specific entity. So we acted on a task. We have a bunch of information about the entity itself, the entity's parents and dependency chain. And as I mentioned, here we can see actually what the changes are. And you can use these IDs to query further into the API to actually get that information. So cool. So let's take a look at the more complex practical example that we looked at. And again, you'll see that it's not too different. A lot of the same code here, or at least the same paradigms here. We've got our callback, and then the same code that, I mean, literally the slide was just copied and pasted from here. And again, the startup code, very similar. We subscribe to that same event and we just bind our callback. So let's go ahead and pop back into the web UI. And we'll go ahead and let's change the status on this one that we just changed last time. So we're going to change our in progress status to pending review. We've done some work. We think we're happy with it. We want to let somebody know that things have happened to it. And if I pop back to my, key piece of info, actually need to run this code. So let me restart my terminal. Okay, and we're back up. So let me reset my share real quick. Back over to the web UI. And let's go ahead and change this again. So we liked our review. The client's happy with it. So we see that change. And if we pop back into Visual Studio, okay, well, we should see something here. Let me try that one more time. Oh, I apologize. This actually has to happen on an asset version. So let's change the status of this asset version. And hopefully we all know what that looks like. So I'm just going to change this to asset version approved. Let's save this. And if we come back into Visual Studio now, so we see that we have printed the change on the name of the asset version and the new status, which is approved, and the state is done. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. And again, these are very simple examples, but these are derived from workflow, production, and some of our recipes. So we definitely recommend that if you want to get a little more complex, and that's the thing with events and triggers, is you can make these as complex as you want. You have access to the full kind of weight of the API here. So anything that you might do in sort of just one of your regular day-to-day scripts, you can more than likely do in an event. So let's hop back to the presentation real quick. And let's take a look at actions. And as we mentioned, an action is really just the same code that you see in an event or in any script. It's just we have a little bit of a shim layer now that exposes this to the web UI that we can either trigger globally or we can trigger from a specific entity. So, and the interesting thing about actions too is you can run those as we've showed with the trigger. Like you can just run it as a Python script, or you can actually hook this or your events as well into Ftrack Connect using a few different environment variables, and Connect will read those as plugins, and Ftrack Connect will then provide those to your server for you. And some examples, you can actually display forms, you can launch applications. In fact, if you're familiar with Connect, all of our application launchers in Connect are actually actions under the hood. So they use the same framework that you would use for your custom actions. And if you're going to write your own integration, this is actually what you would do. You would just implement a Connect action that does some bootstrapping. You point at your DCC, and then you tell it to launch with a specific environment. And another use case that a lot of folks like is to just generate custom reports. So whether that's a project level report or what some developers, myself included, like to do is I have an action where I can just click on an entity or an object and just get a dump, get a debug view. And so things like that are very useful. So a little bit of a difference, like we mentioned, there's a bit more of an API to actions just to help expose it to the web UI, but really it's very simple. The simplest interface is what we have here. So, and from a Python development standpoint, there's probably nothing here you're not familiar with. And again, if you've ever worked with event-based systems, a lot of this is probably similar. We have a register method that essentially just binds our action to the events that we want to listen to. And then discover and launch are two Ftrack API specific things. Discover runs, so for example, say I have an action that I want to spawn from a task. So I right click on a task, my actions interface comes up, and I want to spawn it from there. Discover is what validates our input, filters our selection, and bootstraps the action, and passes all that information to the launch, which is what happens when I actually press the action button. So that's where things like, at least in this case, that's where things like interfaces happen. If I'm showing a custom form, that'll happen in launch. If I'm processing information, that all happens in launch. And it looks something like this. So when we're implementing an action, we want to give it some strings to kind of identify it. These three things, these are what you'll see in the action interface. So when you right click on an entity, pop up the action window, you'll see these, or at least you'll see two of these. You'll see the label and then the description if you tooltip over it. And then the rest of it is a fairly simple exercise in Python implementation. So in our init, in our class constructor, basically we simply just pass in the instance of the session that we want to use. This holds all of our server information and any other relevant system settings that we need for our action to act on. And then register is where discover and launch are bound to. So you can actually extend this and bind to any other events that you're interested in. And I believe these two are the only ones that you actually need, though. So you can keep it simple, or like we mentioned, say you want something to happen on a custom event that you've published, you could add that here as well. And then our launch code, our discover code, as I mentioned, this is where we validate our input. So so we filter our selection by an entity type, and then we just return the information about that as I mentioned, we pass to our launch method, and the launch method makes all the magic happen. So, and we'll take a look at what some of these look like at the end of this section. Now, this is all pretty straightforward, but as you get a little more complex with your action development, as you start to develop more complicated launch methods, for example, as you start doing more work, you'll run up against some really interesting ceilings using this simple method. And this is just an action derived from the base Python object. So we've provided a helper class that we call Ftrack Action Handler, and it actually simplifies the development by it has, under the hood, it has a slightly more complex bootstrapping process, but that means that you as the user or as the developer have to do less in your setup code. And then the other thing that it does that we'll actually call out is that it separates the UI logic from business logic, which is something that I think as developers we're all used to anyway. And so this just enables that. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you remember, our object-based action has these four, but really these three work methods that we care about: register, discover, and launch. So our what we call base action, which is the class in our Ftrack action handler that you'll want to derive your action from if you choose to use this method, is that we have one extra method called interface. And going off that name, if you guess it, that's where you would set up your form, you would set up your widget. You are correct. Now, why do we need to do this? Well, the answer to that lies in how the launch method gets called in if we're using our base, just our object instantiated action. So what we actually have to do is, because launch gets called multiple times, launch gets called to in the object-based case, launch gets called to show the form, launch gets called to process the input. And since that's all in one method, what we have to do is we have to add some branches to check and see if on this instance of launch, have we returned from a form if a form is present? And that's what we're doing right here is we're checking for this values key in the event data, and values is the information that's passed back from a form. So and we'll see this in our example, but for example, if I have a form that's just a text area and I write a string, when I click the action button in that form, it passes that value from the text area back as the values data for that object. So if we don't have values in our key, we can assume pretty safely that we need to show the form. And then once we do have that key data values, then we can actually like process the input. Now, in the base action world, our interface is quite a bit simpler. It does the same check, but instead of showing the form, all we do is if we don't have that key to tell us know that we have returned in fact from the form, we just return. And then we continue doing what we're doing. We set up our widgets, and our widgets are just key value pairs, and we have specific keys, and you can spawn as many of those as you think makes sense. And once this is called, this will show the form. So let's actually not do Q&A yet. Let's pause here, jump back into the editor, and take a look at what actions look like. So both of these actions are going to look the same. We're going to look at what they look like, what the code differences are. And when you get this project at the end of the webinar, you'll be able to step through that yourself. So over here in Visual Studio land, if we look at our action, again, this is pretty much the same thing that we had in the code, and all this is going to do is it's going to pop up a form that lets us add a note to an asset version and apply that to the asset version. So again, just like with an event, we can hit the play button, and oops, I think I was running something already, my bad. We pop back into our web UI. So we'll come to this asset version, and you'll notice that when I right click on this now, I have a list of actions, and I have my action here. And as you can kind of see, this again, the label and the descriptor and from our code are present here. If I click on this, I get a form. So I'll just say, save this change. And then if I come into my notes, I will see that note is in fact there, and that's pretty much all there is to it. As I mentioned, the other implementation of this that we have effectively does the same thing. It's just implemented against that base action class that I mentioned. So I'll go ahead and we don't need to run the demo of that. But like I said, when you get this code after the workshop, I definitely recommend you step through them, look at the differences, decide which case is going to work better for you, because you don't always need to use everything all the time. You might decide that, hey, this action is simple enough that I'm just going to implement it against an object. I don't need a form. I don't need all that simplification. I just want to just do something quick and dirty, and that's absolutely fine. So that's where we are for today. And I guess we'll take a look at the Q&A now, see if we have any questions.
Does not look like we have any live right now.
So we do have a question in the chat. Do events have a project entity associated? Yeah. So when you trigger when the event comes back, yeah, the project ID is actually embedded in that. And like I said, if you can write a very simple stub that just prints out an ID just prints out the whole event, and you'll see where that is. So yeah, you can absolutely get back to a project from an event. And I think as we showed in the demo, from an entity too, you can actually get the whole kind of parent chain too. So you can get this entity's parent, and then from there you can recurse as far as you want to.
Any other questions coming through? I think Jose is coming through again.
Oh, I was hoping this session would be a little longer. I actually added a bunch of extra content, but so it must just be. But hey, maybe that's the awesome thing about the Ftrack API. It's actually very simple, and once you kind of understand the concepts, it just kind of flows. Can we? Yes, you could. Can we have actions on user? You can absolutely filter an action on user. And what you would do is when you bind it to the event, you can actually pass in a specific user. So there's a couple things you can do. You can pass in a user to the event subscription, and we have some documentation that shows this. Or if you're using the action handler class that we showed, you can actually there's some flags you can set where you can restrict an action to a specific user, or you can say spawn this action from a specific user. So yes, you can absolutely segregate actions based on users. Is there a specific topic for changes like changing the name? I don't think there is. I think that all happens on update, but again, you could probably publish a custom thing if you wanted to keep it, if you wanted to keep things a little more readable, a little more specific to your code. But yeah, I believe most of that all happens on update. The other events we have are very specific to things like, like we mentioned, discover and launch events or actions or components created, things like that, or locations have changed. So, but yeah, I don't think we get so granular as to tag specific entity updates. I think it's just all under that update event. Yeah, and these are the events are actually listed in the documentation too. So we'll add that to the notes for this section. So because there's a few different types of events and a few different classes of events. So.
Anything? We'll give some more time for anybody that wants to ask a couple more things. I think we might have a couple people typing.
Hope everybody in the U.S. had a great Thanksgiving break if you celebrate. Thanks for coming back and joining us after that.
And I am going to go ahead and throw the previous. Oh, we have a new one in there.
If an action is triggered by two different users at the same time, does it generate a queue in the system? I don't believe it does. I believe they're both just triggered because the events in this case the events are asynchronous, and I believe the execution is asynchronous too. So yeah, so everybody should just get back what they asked for when they get it. Is there a specific use case you're looking for there? Because there might be a different way to do what it is you're trying to do, though. Question to Lucas for like if you're trying to filter things based on, or if you're trying to have things say be dependent on different users. Yeah, there might like a specific order. There might be another way to do that. Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So in the case of like a cascade set, like if you had multiple people that were acting on say on the same event, I think what would happen is it would so because of how it works. So say if you had two people like do the same thing, yeah, it would basically like it would stack the commits. So whoever did one, I mean, if they did it exactly the same time, that could be really interesting. But if there's a little bit of an offset, then yeah, it's like the first commit would happen, then the second commit would happen. Because remember, like everything happens locally until, like I said, until that commit runs. So if that's something you're concerned about, yeah, I mean, there might be a way you could maybe hook into that and and maybe you could like set a weight on your commit or something like that. Or so that's a good question though. I should get back to our backing guys and see like if there's a BKP for that or. So in that case, I guess like the local execution, kind of like the sort of the local session changes is kind of your queue in that case. But again, since the commit would probably happen at the same time.
Lucas is typing right now in case nobody can see that.
The second person to trigger the same action for a different project would get us. I don't think so. I mean, it might be, yeah. Well, it depends on how big the commit is, because yeah, I mean, I guess in the case of a big commit, you probably would, because if you have, say, you're committing changes to thousands of assets or entities, probably. But for I think for like a single update, like say you're acting on like we showed in the demo. If you were to time it, probably, but it'd probably be very negligible. Yeah, and we actually, I think we mentioned this in the last one, but we have some. I don't want to commit to too much, but we've been doing some interesting work here on performance. So if performance and timing is something you're interested in, stay tuned. I don't know if that's going to be a whole webinar, but it may or may not be a blog post at some point in the future. So.
Jose might be writing in with one more.
Yeah, and Lucas, that's a really great question to maybe as opposed to our Dev Slack as well. If you're not on that, because Dev Slack in the forums, because we're all on the Dev Slack and in the forums. So maybe somebody like Lorenzo or other SE might have more to say about that than me. So.
All right. Thank you for. Oh, we might have one more coming through from Lucas, unless it's just a big fat thanks. Nice. That is what it was. So I think that'll do. Thanks, Seth, so much as usual. The next session, 4 out of 5, is a week from today at the same time, actually. And then the 5th one will actually be on Monday, December 16th, because the Thursday before Christmas, probably not a lot of people coming in. Yeah, we also have one more session of the Ftrack Advice Clinic, which is more general UI oriented. If people want to do some more of that, but this is the fun dev stuff that gets real deep. I am going to, or I have posted the link to last week's session and 2 weeks ago session in the chat here, or 3 weeks ago, who knows time. But at this point, from the whole team at Ftrack, we appreciate you spending your time with us. And hope you all took something away during the training, and we'll see you guys next week. Share the links out, and we're happy to help.
Cheers, folks.